now have the opportunity of a keynote speech from Professor Winston. And Professor Winston is based at Imperial College, where he's been running a program focused on children and has done a lot of research in that area, and also spent a lot of time on the road meeting and seeing what's happening in action. He will do a keynote speech through to the coffee break. So if we may welcome on stage Robert Winston.
Good morning. I'm, as usual, totally disorganized. So I've just got to get my computer connected up because we had difficulty running this presentation from the back, so forgive me just for a moment. I'm going to talk about some of the stuff we're doing with children at Imperial College where I work. And basically we're running a fairly extensive program on both secondary and primary school education. But this morning, I want to talk about our very early learning experiences. So hopefully we can get this thing running and we can start. So excuse me while we hang on. The first thing I want to suggest to you is that at all ages, and what I'm primarily going to be focusing on are very young children, is that we use metaphor, because in fact, when we learn, different pathways in the brain are activated simultaneously. And so to give you an idea of this, we're going to, this clicker's not going to work. So let's just use my hand, there we are. So the things I want to suggest to you is that first of all, we learn fastest when we're youngest. In the 1960s, there was an important experiment done at Oxford, which would now be unethical, where a newborn cat, a kitten, was blindfolded, and the blindfold would be taken off at various intervals after it had been put on with different animals. And after 4 to 5 weeks, the blindfold having been removed, the cornea, the retina, the eye, the muscles around the eye would be completely normal, the optic nerve would be normal, and the connections with the optic cortex at the back of the brain in the cat would be normal. But that cat, after removing the blindfold, would be permanently visually impaired, blind. Because, of course, what is happening is that experience leads to the connections between neurons in the brain. So we basically learn by experience. And that's the thing I want to emphasize with you most of all. And that experience, of course, is obviously fastest when the brain is at its most plastic. So to continue, the other thing I want to point out to you is that we humans, Homo sapiens, are essentially communicating animals. This remarkable photograph, which is described by Sarah Jane Blakemore, who's done a great deal of work with adolescent children in Britain, probably one of our leading experts in education and neuroscience. What she's showing here is the moment when Michael Owen, playing for Liverpool, misses an absolute clear goal in front of Manchester United. And you can see simultaneously everybody is showing the same process in their brain. So we communicate instantaneously, and the research at University College London shows that that communication starts within about 40 milliseconds of seeing an event, or in particular, seeing a human face. So that is very, very significant indeed. Most of the work I'm referring to will be, in fact, MRI scanning. This is the scan of my middle son's brain, and he's particularly interested in this area of the brain, the amygdala. As far as I can see, he's got a normal brain. Now, I want to talk to you about metaphor. And in order to do that, I want to demonstrate something about how we connect up neurons in the brain. So I'm going to be self-indulgent and show you a film of using metaphor in the learning process. What tests show is that people actually remember this much more effectively because of the metaphor than they would do if they were just told about synapses. No sound. Can we get the sound up?
The way her brain works. Our brain has an astonishing 100 billion neurons, or brain cells, all connected together. Learning is about creating, and strengthening pathways through these neurons for impulses of electricity. But between each and every connection in our brains, there's a tiny gap called a synapse. For any of us to learn something new, the electrical signal has to jump across this gap to continue its journey.
The gap between the two brain cells is tiny, but that doesn't mean that it's straightforward for a signal to get from one side to the other. For us, it's like crossing a deep ravine.
I'm going to try to get from one side to the other, and how I do it should tell me something about the way we learn. The first time a signal crosses from one brain cell to the other demands the most effort, and it's the same when we cross our ravine.
The first trip across is the hardest.
Having crossed the ravine once, the journeys across get easier and easier. And a similar thing happens when we learn something.
To start with, learning is difficult. As the signal crosses the gap between the brain cells again and again, we establish a more solid pathway.
Sorry about that. By the time we've made the crossing over and over again, it becomes effortless. We can do it whenever we like. We finally learned something. So that's a process which is going on in young people's brains at a much faster rate than any time in our brains as we get older. Though, of course, the anatomy of your brain will have changed by the end of the day as you've made new connections in your synapses, because you will have learned something. Even if you've been totally bored, you'll know not to come again. Now, I've just shown on this slide very quickly 4 great names. This is Marie Curie, important. Sad that we've only got one female scientist on this slide, Isaac Newton, Albert Einstein, and Francis Crick. When Albert Einstein was examined after his death, within 7 hours of his death, his brain was taken out. His brain, in fact, as it turned out, was entirely different, similar to anybody else's brain, with around 100 billion neurons. The interesting issue is that partly any two of you in this audience working together in collaboration have more brain capacity than Albert Einstein. And that's an important thing to consider with children, because, of course, one of the things we need to be teaching rather than competition is actually collaboration. So that is one of the issues, I think, in learning, which often we are forgetting with the target system we run in our educational system. The other issue is very much all sorts of sensations are involved in learning. This little child was dying, the identical twin of, similar twin to this child, Curie. They were put together in the incubator together completely illegally by the nurse. This one was needing 2 tubes to feed it. It was still losing weight. This one was thriving. And the moment this photograph was taken, within a few hours, this child started absorbing its food. Extraordinary, that sense of touch with the immature brain was actually critical in that child's recovery. They both left hospital, 34-week gestations, so 6 weeks early, but they both left hospital as normal infants. To be even more self-indulgent, I want to show you this little girl, aged 1. This is Sophie, and she shows something very important. She's going to meet with an accident. She doesn't yet have language. I think you get the point. The most important piece of technology in that family is pretty obvious, isn't it? Notice that this child, at the age of 1, by the way, I should point out that I do have an interest. This is a grandchild. He's now 5. But this child is communicating. So this communication is built into the brain. And to some extent, this is not learnt. This is also hardwired. But the other key issue, of course, is imitation. So that is a very important issue as well in the learning process. So to move on quickly, I want to suggest to you that perhaps watching videos and watching television and social media are not necessarily bad things in learning. This is an experiment we did in Cambridge with a stickleback which was failing to feed.
These fish have got a tiny brain.
We may need to bump up the sound a little bit. Thank you.
You wouldn't think that they could learn from experience, but they do. Much of what they need to know, like that these red worms are delicious, they don't just know, they have to learn. Stupid fish. You're going to starve. Usually they learn things like red worms are nice from other fish. But look what happens when a lone fish gets to watch the fish food program on telly.
This is not a fake, this is genuinely happening. So this is a fish with a brain the size of a pinhead. I think we have to learn that we mustn't actually condemn these sorts of methods of learning. It's going to be increasingly important in every aspect of education, as it are for young children as well. The other issue I want to suggest to you, and I declare a bit of an interest here, I'm chairman of the Royal College of Music, is that really I think that we underuse music. I want to show you Glenn Gould, that remarkable pianist who stopped playing in public at the age of 20. Here he is playing a Bach partita on the piano, and it seems a shame to talk over him. But I want you to watch his face very carefully. And notice he's singing completely out of tune, as he always did, even though he has perfect pitch. I could spend the rest of my 15 minutes actually just talking about Glenn Gould, but we better move on. But I want to point out to you that he's phonating every single note that he's playing on the piano. In his case, it's obvious. Actually, in fact, that's what musicians do a great deal of the time anyway. And of course, it turns out that Broca's area, the speech area, and where he's actually processing music are very close to each other in that left side of his cortex. Now, that's important because, of course, what we're not doing, I think, nearly enough in schools, is using alternative ways of learning during the learning process. I rate music very, very highly here for lots of reasons, for collaboration, for memory, for articulation, for speech unquestionably, probably for reading, though there needs to be more research to be done on that. And that's something we're doing at the Royal College of Music at the moment to see how much we can enhance the learning process in non-musicians. Now, here you see a little girl, Romy, who has no speech. She's 14, and she's really retarded. So look at her, how she picks up music remarkably quickly. In fact, she will have not heard any of these tunes, including the Handel theme, before this morning. She's with her professor, Adam Ackleford, at Roehampton, who's been studying her progress. Notice her left hand. She doesn't want to play with her left hand, even though she can, because she wants to touch Oglethorpe. Now, her learning process is unquestionably related to her state of mind. She's unbelievably happy in front of the piano. That's what her great joy is doing. And again, you'll see she's picked up tunes from that this morning, and she even make variations on them. We must move on. So I want to argue with you that speech and music share similar processing skills, and I think there's a real potential here for greater use, particularly, for example, in video material as well. Here's an experiment done by Kleber, who showed that actually he could put people who were non-musicians in a scanner, having compared them with professional singers, opera singers, and he could demonstrate that after about 4 months, he could show exactly the same hypertrophy of the motor cortex and an increasing hypertrophy of the auditory cortex as well, exactly similar to the professional musicians. These were students at his university. And so this was simply done by constant practice while they're in the scanner. And another very interesting experiment done by Pantev rather more recently, which, well, it's not that recent actually, it's about 10 years ago, is that really what we can see is that the learning process is most effective the earlier people start. So we're talking about certainly learning to play before the age of 4 even, and certainly playing an instrument regularly by the age of 4, 5, or 6. And this means that these children above the line will be likely to have perfect pitch. So here's one outlier, but that would be the normal for the average population. So what we can do using magnetic recording on the brain is to measure how the cortex is actually recruiting neurons. And we can see, for example, with violinists and with pianists who use all 5 fingers, that they have a much greater area of the cortex which is employed to run their little finger. We can demonstrate this by putting pressure on the little finger and then recording what happens in the cortex. And so in a violinist, you can see a much greater area is recruited simply through constant practice. And there would be a normal person, a control, with a much shorter area in the brain. This actually is a problem for musicians because sometimes when they recruit too many neurons, they can get confusion and they have to then rest for a while to overcome the dystonia which can occur. Another really important issue in learning is empathy. For example, this wonderful experiment by Tanya Singer shows that people who are subjected to an electric shock in the front in a scanner whilst their loved one is watching them, the activation in the pathways of the brain are identical in both sides. We're going to miss this video and carry on, if you don't mind. Memory is critically important. It's very clear that people who have happy memories will tend to be happier later on in life, and we can create false memories. So here, for example, what we've done with children that we've been studying is to show their parents a picture of them when they were 6 in a hot air balloon. It's a complete fake, in fact, because in fact none of them have been in a hot air balloon, but remarkably within 48 hours after being shown this Photoshop image of them in a hot air balloon, they remembered seeing the field 2,000 feet below them, the sheep grazing, being frightened of the basket falling down. So you can see that actually those memories are very much modulated by their state of mind. Happier people tended to find happier messages from that completely false memory. I have to say, too, that sometimes when one's looking at children around the world, we're very lucky in countries like this. Every single person in this photograph, with the exception of her, me, her, and him, is dead. They all died. They've all are orphans in East Africa, and I spent the afternoon face painting in that orphanage. But the extraordinary thing about those children is that they were remarkably happy, even though the graveyard, you can see it in the background, is that's where they're going, and they know that because they're all infected with HIV, which is what their parents died of. What was remarkable to me was the happiness and their ability to learn in that environment. And the reason for that, of course, was because of the dedication and the love given to them by the adult people who were looking after them. Let me just now come to final childhood experience. This is Gustav Mahler. And Gustav Mahler, in his slow movement of his first symphony, wrote this piece of music. It's a tune that will be familiar to you. It's Frère Jacques, played twice as slow as normal, and in a minor key, so he's changed it into a funeral march. What's going on? Well, Mahler was a Jew living in a pub in the far east part of Bohemia. His father was a publican. Every single one of his siblings died and was carried out in a coffin in the back room. But in the front room of the parlor, this is going on. Listen to the woodwind. It's a klezmer dance. So here is the irony that he's describing in his childhood. And this leaves a massive impact on this man's composition. This is a great genius, unquestionably. The genius is unhappy. It makes his creativity. But Mahler, throughout his life, is obsessed with death. So actually that childhood experience, from the very earliest stage of seeing all his siblings one by one dying from the age of 1, has this deep effect on how he composes. And of course it leads to this despair in his final unpublished work, the 10th Symphony, where he describes the pain of living and says farewell, because actually his learnt experience has been so unhappy. Let me just finally deal with laughter. In my view, laughter is very important in learning, and the best way of showing this is in this little video clip. So if we bump the sound up, there's a physiological reason for considering laughter.
Feel good. And one way to do that is by making us laugh. And when we laugh, our heart beats faster, we breathe more, and more oxygen goes to the brain. And the brain liberates chemicals called endorphins, which make us feel good and causes exhilaration. And laughter reduces stress levels and boosts the immune system, which makes us less prone to illness. So it's not surprising that people who make me laugh make me well disposed towards them. We did an experiment with our children to discover if laughter is truly infectious. Our children watched a selection of funny programs. On their own, the children barely smiled. But put 2 girls together, or 2 boys, and they start to find it quite funny. But put the girl with a boy, and the girl thinks it's hysterical. Laughing isn't just an expression of amusement. It's a social signal to show everything's all right. And it seems girls are particularly sensitive to this. When Helena watches funny cartoons with James, she gets such a rush of the feel-good factor that she gets completely carried away. Children this age laugh or smile 400 times a day.
So, I've got a conflict of interest here because I'm on the board of an organization called Dream Learners. What we have been starting to work on for some time now is a platform on a handheld tablet which tells stories particularly at bedtime when learning is at its greatest. And of course, this is something in the home where all the research shows that learning at home is always going to be more effective than learning in school. From Grace Davies' work, for example, we can see in her book, for example, Believing Not Belonging, there's a wonderful example there of all that research which shows very clearly that ultimately the home environment is the most critical feature. You can have the best teachers in the world, but if kids go back to a home where there's no intent on education, it's much more difficult to get them up to the level that we need in our society. So what Dream Learners is doing is providing a home environment, and I want to just show you one very brief promotional clip, just about 20 seconds, of a woman who's showing how her child was absolutely failing to read and was then using these cartoon characters who are teaching her embedded educational things in each story, in each metaphor which is being shown to the child. So here she is talking with her kid here, just a few seconds, because she's arguing that everything else has failed. Don't seem to have the sound. Well, can we manage the sound? We seem to be blanked out. Basically, what she's saying is that having tried everything and failing at school with all sorts of different educational aids, when she tried this platform approach, this changed his whole ability to learn, and in particular, now this child is thoroughly enjoying reading and is much more proficient at doing it. That's pretty well what she's saying. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'll leave you to ponder this ability to use, in my view, new media in a more intelligent way with carefully programmed material which provides some of the issues that I've been speaking to you about this morning. Thank you for listening to me.